Jeremy, thanks for coming on your very first podcast ever. I'm glad I could be the one to introduce you to that.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here.
And today, no, yeah, absolutely. And today, we're going to talk about probably me and Brad's one of our favorite subjects, mountain men. My first exposure to a mountain man was probably the same as a lot of people's through Jeremiah Johnson, the movie. The young guy coming out of the woods with the bear skin over his head, running through the cabin and running away from the bear. Just this crazy story of an outdoorsman, right? But the more I read about mountain men, I don't think it's quite that way. And I think it's a little more complex than I think. And Jeremy, I visited the Wyoming State Museum back in July. And I was really impressed. You've got a great exhibit on mountain men. And I knew it was something I wanted to learn a little bit more about. So that's kind of why I wanted to have you on.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to be here. Yeah.
So what is your title with the Wyoming Museum?
Yeah, so I am the curator of education at the Wyoming State Museum. So when you think about pretty much everything for school-age kids involving like classroom setting, that's me. So our virtual field trips, kind of like what we're doing right now, teaching over the internet, whether it's Zoom or Google Meet or Teams or whatever else. Our on-grounds field trips, our school groups are coming to us, our education trunks, and kind of all the other education pieces of the museum, including like some of the educational stuff that's out in the museum, like our hands-on habitat room, where kids and adults alike can come and learn about animals and get hands-on with skulls and pelts and crawl through tunnels and go in a bear cave and a whole bunch of other fun stuff. My job is kind of all the educational components of the museum.
And how long have you been with the museum?
Yeah, so not too long. I started just before COVID. So January of 2020 is when I started. Although I do have almost 20 years in informal education. I've worked everything from the working education at Sunset Zoo, accredited zoo in Manhattan, Kansas, after I graduated from K-State, to work in the private sector doing education, and now back to the public sector with the museum. But I've been here a little less than 2 years, yeah. But it's been great. The museum here, like you said, is an amazing museum. I'm so proud of the work that we do and the fact that everything we do is free. All of our community and family programs, programs for seniors, programs for schools, the museum itself is free. It's just a really amazing institution that is just really trying to help the world learn and view culture and history and animals and conservation a little bit differently than they did before.
I was going to mention that. Wyoming is a weird state. So, for one, it's the least populated state in the lower 48. Is that right?
It is the least populated state in the man, you meant to fact check me, but I believe we're the least populated state in the nation. Now, population by square mile, I think Alaska has less population by square mile. But I believe, and maybe one of you can do a quick Google real fast, but I believe we have the lowest population of all states in the nation. There's some territories with lower population than us. I think like Guam has lower population, if I remember correctly. Once again, fact check that. But yeah, I believe we're the least populated state in the nation. Even DC has a higher population than us. Which, yes, I know is not a state.
So Wyoming's got that going. Wyoming's got that going for it. And then on top of that, Wyoming is just this wild place that's unlike anywhere I've ever really been. Brad, you have...
It is absolutely beautiful. Yes, I went through the South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota strip.
It's a wonderful place. And what's really unique about Wyoming is that we have kind of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains both. And so we're kind of the edge, as in many states along the Front Range, as we call it here. We've got the prairie coming up, but we also, in our Great Plains, not just shortgrass prairie, but also stuff like sagebrush steppe. But we have the big open Great Plains just button right up against the Rocky Mountains. So you can go through our state and see a vast amount of different habitats and the thermal activity we have here, whether it's from Yellowstone or Thermopolis. There's just so many different habitats and wildlife that you can see right here that you really can't see in the average state in the U.S.
And Wyoming feels like it's carried that wild culture throughout its history. I mean, even today, this feels different when you get up there. I just live about 45 minutes from Cheyenne, but once I cross the border, I'm like, okay, I'm not in Colorado anymore. It feels
Yeah, I make that trip a lot, right up I-25, and you're right. Like in the winter, it's almost like you cross the border right there, and all of a sudden, for many days of the year, it's like blizzard. All of a sudden, like it's like Colorado, the wind knows not to blow too hard, but you cross into Wyoming, and it's just snow whipping across the highway. But it's a place it's like unlike any other, and it's an amazing place to live and work.
okay. We need to start talking about mountain because I'm chomping.
Yeah, that's why I'm here.
In our discussions,
I've never heard of it. I don't quite understand the subject here.
Hopefully, I can help with that.
In our
I
conversation,
guarantee you can.
you mentioned that the fur trade started before it even approached the United States. So we're talking, across the Atlantic in Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
Can you give a brief rundown of kind of how that all started?
Yeah, absolutely. So to understand the mountain man, which is really just, 40, 50 years maybe of North American history, to understand that little, very important piece of our history in the Rocky Mountains, we have to go back from not start in the 1800s when the mountain men were existing, but go back to the 1500s. We're talking before the steam locomotive, before the light bulb, before cars, before Mozart was born, before peanut butter was invented, before indoor toilets, when people thought the earth was flat. Although I guess some people still do think the earth is flat, but so we're going way back, and to understand how the mountain men fit into the story of the fur trade, you have to go back to Europe, and the story of the mountain men really belong with the Basque people. Now, many people don't know about the Basque people, but they're a culture of people that lived and live in southern France, northern Spain area. And there were some Basque fishermen who were out by Newfoundland, and they were fishing for cod. And they started trading with the local indigenous people there for beavers. And they made basically beaver robes to wear to keep them warm on the long boat rides. Well, in the late 1500s, the second half of the 1500s, basically hatters, people who made hats, realized those beaver skins and beaver fur, really, not really the skins, but the fur was amazing to make hats out of. And that is where the beaver craze started. And what happened to the first little turning cog that started the mountain man period. It was all about hats. Now, when you think about hats, a lot of people think about something like a raccoon skin hat. So this is a raccoon skin hat right here. And raccoon skin hats, the inside of them, it's literally a pelt that's sewn into the shape of a hat. So it's got skin all the way underneath. Sometimes there's some like cloth on the inside too, but it's an entire skin. It's pretty simple to make. Well, beaver hats or beaver felt hats were completely different. Now, when you think about beavers, by the way, it's probably important to know there's two species of beavers in the world. There's the Eurasian beaver, Europe and Asia, and the North American beaver. And that while they look similar, they're pretty different, and you can't really, they can't interbreed or anything, like a horse and a donkey or anything. So to get these felt beaver hats, which, by the way, were not all top hats. Men wore them in many different styles, military hats, top hats, all different shapes and styles. But basically, they would let me show you. Well, if you're looking at some of the videos, this is a beaver skin right here. You can see they can get pretty big. Now, like a lot of aquatic animals, yeah, pretty big, right? And this one's been touched by a few, like 10,000 children by now, and it's still holding up. But like many aquatic animals, beavers have two types of fur. If you look at the beaver, there's these long guard hairs on the outside, which is what you kind of see. But then under that, there's all this thick, short hair. Now, what the hatters would use to make hats is actually what is underneath these long hairs. So when a hatter got a beaver pelt, they had to pull off all of the hairs the long hairs. And once they got all the long hairs pulled off, that's when they would shave the skin. After that, the process was a little intense. It involved a lot of boiling and dipping and steaming and pressing it into molds and turning that hair into felt. Now, here's where it gets a little crazy. 1700s-ish, they start this process called keratin, where they add this orangey, kind of like carrot mixture to the process that helps it become much stronger, felt, and faster. But the chemical that they used to make that was mercury. And so what started happening is these hatters started having basically severe mercury poisoning over once they worked with it for a long time. They started getting nerve damage, psychological damage. They would get very irritable, short-tempered, speech problems, drooling, shaking, hallucinations, insanity. Sometimes their wives would have to feed them because they started shaking so bad. This is where the term "Mad as a Hatter" came from. And Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter, it came from basically these hatters working with mercury. Now, like across Europe, like the beaver populations plummet. So, like, let's see here, by 1500, before the end of the 1500s, all the beavers are gone from England. They're gone from Europe by the end of the 1700s, a general rule. They got down to 1,190 Eurasian beavers in the world. So they used to range all over. We're talking Siberia, Russia, down to Mongolia, all over Europe to England, down into like Turkey. These Eurasian beavers were everywhere. But because of the men's hat trade and the crazy trapping, they got down to like less than 1,200 of them, almost went extinct.
That is insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. But then around the same time, thinking like the 1500s, 1600s, that's when European powers are starting to colonize the New World, North America. And that's where our story really picks up in chapter 2. It's like when we get to North America with all these sailing ships,
Before we get to chapter, I've got a quick question. Though.
Hit me. Yeah, hit me. Please interrupt me. Hit me. I'll talk forever. I get jazzed about this stuff.
Can you hold up that felt hat again?
Hold the felt hat up? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I look at that hat, if you would not have told me that was beaver, I would not have known.
Now,
not even.
Now let me let you in on a little trade secret. You ready here? So this is a felt hat, but this is from our teaching collection, not a permanent collection. Because I'm not wearing gloves. Anything in our permanent collection, you're going to see me throw some gloves on before I show you the big beaver over here, which I could probably show you right now, actually. So this technically is just a felt hat. I highly doubt this is beaver hat. It was in our teaching collection long before I started, and it's made for children to be able to touch. So I can't tell you emphatically if this is beaver, but a beaver hat would look just like this. Just like this. I mean, it's just felt. What's amazing about beaver felt hats, though, is that they are basically waterproof. Because beavers are basically
questions. One.
Yeah. Let me show you this beaver over here.
Moving the long hairs, and then they're shaving that hat to give it that shape and texture.
Yeah. So what they kind of do is they boil and go through all these processes I'm not knowledgeable enough to tell you the exact process to turn beaver skin or beaver hair. But once they pull out all the long hairs and they shave off all the short hair, so short hairs go into a big mixture, and boiled, compressed, and steamed, and then eventually there was keratin. And by the way, keratin with mercury wasn't outlawed in the U.S. until, was it in the 40s, I think? Yeah, 1941. It was still used in the U.S., mercury, to make hats until 1941. Crazy, right? But yeah, and eventually once they get the pieces of felt, that's where they steam it and put it over a mold. Because these beaver hats turn into so many different shapes. So once they got the felt, they would steam it, compress it, heat it up, and shape it around a mold. And the mold is what turned it into the hat shape.
Was it just the waterproof quality that they were looking for in the beaver pelts? Is that what made it so desirable?
Waterproof. It's also really, really thick. and you were able to get waterproof, thick, high quality hats. So like this is a permanent collection beaver. I'm not gonna like touch him or anything. I'll show you more of the skin. But if you've ever touched a beaver, and hopefully at some point in your life you can touch a beaver pelt, maybe not a wild beaver because they have giant teeth that have iron in them to chew through trees. But beavers have really, really thick, soft fur. And that really thick, soft fur plus the waterproofing qualities based off their, their oil and stuff, it made it really, 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 useful for hats. There wasn't the only thing. I'll show you another animal here a little bit later that was also used, but yeah, beavers were definitely the most desirable. And the mountain men fur trade all on the back of beavers.
I've actually got to tan a beaver hide before, Jeremy.
Oh, that's
and
amazing.
And I can concur with the soft fur. It is the softest fur I've ever felt ever. And while I was skinning the pelt, it had a really sweet type like smell. It didn't stink. What is it?
That's probably the castor. They have scent glands in their booty area. And they have these 2 castor glands. And we'll talk more about castor here in a little bit. But yeah, I bet it was the castor you were smelling.
It was a great smell, but I still have the pelt. Yeah. Now, Zach, you was with me.
I will tell you the other thing that precipitated the downfall of the beavers was not just the skin, but that castor. Now, different than castor oil. Castor oil comes from the castor bean, like the stuff from Mary Poppins. Take your castor oil. But castor from a beaver, they used extensively, and still do use some in perfumes. And so they would use that castor gland for perfumes. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, if you know there are questions, we can pick up in the beavers.
Yeah, I was going to say, once the beavers were all trapped out of Europe and Asia, who were some of the first people to cross the Atlantic and make it over into North America?
Yeah, and so there's a lot of as we learn in U.S. history as kids, a lot of different settlements. But when you think about trapping beavers, it really was starting with the French and the British. Now, what's really, really important to recognize is that when the European immigrants first landed in what would become the United States and Canada, they didn't really know how to trap beavers. Like they weren't experts in it and stuff like that. Most of the trapping, especially early on, we're talking the early 1600s, that came from the Native American people. The British and the French, starting with the French, the first French guy, Chaplin, I don't know how to pronounce that with a French accent, but with the Native American people up in Canada. They call them the First Peoples in Canada. We call them Native Americans here. They call them First Peoples. But he would trade with the First Peoples. And he's one of the first documented people who were setting up trading sites where Native people could come and trade with the European powers. And so that's about 1608 when he gets that first trading going from the French to the northern First Peoples up in present-day Canada. But pretty soon after that, King Charles II is coordinated in England, or in Britain, I should say, in 1661. And in 1670, he gives all of the tributaries that drain into the Hudson Bay, that huge bay up in Canada, he gives all of that to the Hudson Bay Company. And that's when the Hudson Bay Company really kicks off. So when you think about the early histories from like the 1600s to the 1700s, it's basically this power struggle between the tribes of that area, the eastern tribes and eastern northern tribes, and they're trading with the 2 major superpowers, Britain and France. And all that back and forth. There were some wars that were fought. There's a 5 Nations Beaver Wars that were basically the different indigenous people fighting to figure out who was going to control the best beaver trapping areas to be able to trade with France and with Britain. There was then later a war between France and all 5 of those nations, where France was trying to, bully their way into a more trapping area, because those European nations at the same time were trying to kind of muscle out the native people from being the middleman to do their own trapping. So over time, it goes from predominantly Native American trapping to where European immigrants are also starting to do some of that trapping as well. But kind of what happens during this whole time is the beaver populations up in the eastern North America, northern North America, they start plummeting. Before European Americans got here to the North America, there were about 150 million beavers in the continent. Well, these populations plummet, and the trapping becomes more and more difficult. The native people who rely on these trapping, the native people, remember, they didn't make their own pots and pans out of metal or metal arrowheads or guns or ammunition or any of that. That was all traded goods. Anything metal was a traded good, and anything made of like cotton or wool, at least early on, was all traded from the European people. And so the beaver trade was really important important for them, I should say. But because of this competition between the native people, the native tribes, the European powers, the beaver population just plummets. And it gets to the point, we become a country in 1776, or at least we declare independence. When you hop forward to, 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, this is where the story of the mountain men really picks up. Because while the populations and most, American people at that time are trapping out east where there's not really many beavers left, when Lewis and Clark go through their expedition in 1804 to 1806, their writings, when they come back, they talk about the insane wealth of animals and natural resources and beavers. And this one point, the Lewis and Clark expedition, is what causes all the formation of a ton of fur companies to start up and start sending young men out to the mountain man period. And so this is where a mountain man story really picks up from this beaver population, overhunting of Eurasian beavers, overhunting of North American beavers in the east and the northeast. And that opens up this new land for European powers to get into, which they didn't really have access to before, especially the American trappers who now own, the American government now owns all this land, even though it is technically, still tribal land. And, we can talk about, next all about like what it was like to be a mountain man, but this is what really started that.
Before we go on and talk about what it's like to be a mountain man, the Native American culture surrounding beavers, what did they use their pelts for? Was it clothing? Did they make habitat out of it? How did they use beaver pelts?
Yeah, so, and if you think about the different tribes, Native American tribes that lived in different parts of North America were vastly different. And I don't want to try to lump them all into one people, because the tribes from present-day Mexico, from present-day Oregon, from present-day Canada, the Iroquois out east, different from the plains culture that we normally have here in like Wyoming, different from, the California tribes. And so different geographic areas had very different cultures. Now, additionally, even if we just look at the plains culture, which is what I have the most knowledge about, this is what I teach kids about here at the museum, there were many different plains tribes, and each tribe could have different belief structures, different rituals, different, ways they used animals. But if we're talking in very broad generalizations for the plains people here in the Great Plains, the beaver was mainly used for clothing because they were very warm, but they also could eat them as well. They were a food source as well. But they also relied heavily, the plains culture relied heavily on the American bison, what a lot of people call the buffalo, but real name is bison. And so those bison skins, they would turn bison skins, winter skins, would be turned to clothing and blankets and robes, where summer skins would be turned into like teepees and stuff like that. And so there's the animal that the Native American people relied on, of the Great Plains, relied on most heavily was the bison. If you guys want to have me on for another time, I can talk all about the bison culture of the Great Plains people. But for the beaver, it was mainly clothes and then food.
I can listen to that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you piqued my interest on biting. So I read a really good book. Steve Ranella wrote a book called American Buffalo, uh, and it really piqued my interest and opened my eyes to how important buffalo were to the American tribes in the Great Plains. But me and Brad, we're originally from the Ohio River Valley, so the Shawnee Indian culture is really big there. Um, and we've seen beaver and such there, but I didn't really realize there were a bunch of beavers here in the Western Plains, Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but
Yeah, kind of historically, if you think pre-European invasion to the continent, if you think, but before that, I mean, generally speaking, huge generalization here, 150 million beavers. If you're not in deserty and really warm areas, they thrive in at least cold winters. They like it a little chillier. But in most wetland areas, you probably would have found some beavers back in the day. It's like starlings today. You can't shake a stick somewhere without finding starlings, Yeah. Well, so a cool.
Brad, before we get on to the, go ahead, Jeremy. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, do you have anything else you want to ask me before we move on to like the actual mountain man culture?
That's what I was hearing. Brad, you got anything to ask about before we get into mountain men culture?
Oh man, I'm waiting for this mountain man section. this is one of my favorite subjects of all time.
Oh, wonderful. Well, so you were talking about. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've read the book, The Revenant, and when you read that book, you get this idea of a mountain man that's kind of this rapscallion, roughneck, trying to escape the East, looking for his fortunes out West kind of person. Are those the kind of people that were attracted to this, post Lewis and Clark movement out West?
Yeah. So they're definitely people who wanted to go out and experience nature. Now, there were a ton of people, though, who went out to be mountain men who were not prepared and would either die in the first year or after a season or two would go back east. The average tenure for a mountain man for the lowest levels was about 2.7 years. For the higher level, like the mid-level, it was about 6.3 years. And so, there's this real romanticized. It's been romanticized about mountain men. And some of it is true and some of it's not. So you talked about early on in your intro, you talked about this like old grizzled man coming out and, covered in these furs and stuff. It may surprise you to know most mountain men were teenagers or in their 20s, with some in their 30s. Now, there were some 60-year-old mountain men, absolutely, some famous ones at that. But the overwhelming majority were young men. We're talking teens as early as 16. John Coulter, he was 16 when he came out. And Jim Bridger, he was 17 when he first became a mountain man. So teenagers who would still be in high school here in today's, standards, leaving their families and going out into the middle of the wilderness to become trappers. Now, also 20s and 30s and some of all ages, but it really were people who did want to go out west, but there were some traits you needed to survive. Now, the other big thing that's sometimes a misnomer is that these were people, these men out by themselves, surviving by themselves and, living on their own. And that's just not accurate for the vast majority of mountain men. So there's some different fur companies. Pacific Fur Company, that's more like out Oregon, Washington now. But we got the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a huge one here, the American Fur Company, Hudson Bay Company as well, as I'm sure you can guess. What would happen is these companies would hire young men to go out and trap, and they would send out in brigades. Now, these brigades could be 30 men or 30 people, more on that in a second, 30 people, 50 people, sometimes 100 people going out into the wilderness to trap. And what they would do is they would set up kind of a base camp somewhere. Trapping mainly happened in the spring and the fall. What they wanted was, like a lot of cold dwelling animals, they get really thick fur in the winter and then they shed it, after it gets warmer. And so they wanted the thickest fur. So they would trap in the fall before the rivers and lakes and ponds were completely frozen, and then back out in the spring after the thaw before the shed. Those are the huge trapping time periods. But they would go out and they would, have these huge groups. And there'd be someone in charge, the boss man. And he would break them up into smaller groups and then smaller groups and smaller groups, and they would fan out. Eventually, you might get down to a pair a lot of times, or maybe a solo person who would go out for the day, set traps, trap for beavers, and then come back into smaller groups in the evening. But it definitely, for most of them, it was communal. Now, the way this company, they call it company man versus free trapper or fur trapper, free trapper, fur trapper versus the company man. Most mountain men were company men. Now, the lowest level people, the greenhorns, if you will, new to the Rocky Mountains, they're also called pork biters, kind of eating the lowest level of food. But they would maintain the camp. They didn't do a lot of trapping. They maintained the camp. They cooked food. They set up whatever dwelling they had. More on that in a minute. But they would set this up, and these lower greenhorn people would be in charge of the camp. Now, one of my favorite little anecdotes is you could normally tell greenhorns from the higher echelons of mountain men by what they were wearing. So this is a good example of a mountain man shirt for a greenhorn right here. A cotton shirt would have been bought, out east before they went out. So the greenhorns you could usually find wearing cotton, wool, very eastern bought clothes. Because if you were a mountain man for too many years, you could spend years out there before you went home. Pretty soon your eastern bought clothes wore down, and you're basically wearing the same clothes as Native American people. Furs, buckskins and stuff like that. And so a lot of times the more tenured mountain men would have on mainly buckskin furs and stuff like that, as opposed to the greenies who were wearing the more cotton and eastern bought clothes. Now, once you got that lower level, who basically just got paid, they didn't really get supplies bought for them, they were just paid by the company. Then you got to the next level. Now, these people, these mountain men, they got paid by the company, but they also got paid for their furs. They were actual trappers. And what would happen is they would go out, spend the entire year trapping. The entire year trapping bison furs, bison skins. They would skin them. I'll talk about how we skin them here in a little bit, but they would skin them, prepare them into skins, and then they had to sell those to their company. There was no shopping around for the best price. Your company sent you out, they paid you, and you had to sell all of your skins to your company during the rendezvous. More on that in a minute. We got
a question.
Yeah, hit me.
I got a question, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Was it just the freelancers that would go to the rendezvous and sell their furs, or was that the companies also?
It was everyone. So give me 1 second. I'll get to that next. So you've got the lower level people who aren't trapping. The first level of fur trappers, the company would not only pay them, but the company would also pay for at least some, if not all, of their supplies, their gear, guns and traps and all of that. But they had to sell all their furs to their company at the rendezvous. Then the next level were still a company man, but they were kind of the highest level through tenure and stuff like that. The company paid them, and the company said you had to sell us at least a certain quantity of skins. But after you reach that quantity, any above that quantity, you could sell to whoever you wanted. So the company they didn't mandate all your skins, but a certain quota of skins. After your quota was met, you could sell to other people. Now, the highest echelon were the free trappers. This was more dangerous because you may have a friend you're going out with, but sometimes these were the people who were out in the wilderness by themselves. The free trappers were significantly more rare. Sometimes there were company men who had worked off their debts for all the supplies that the company had paid for them. They had paid that debt off, and now they're a free trapper. And they could sell to the highest bidder. But also, if there was too much that year, too many furs, they also would sometimes find themselves back in debt because they would need to buy stuff. Now, where are they sold to? Well, let's talk about how they trap, and then we'll get to the rendezvous. You guys okay with that?
Yeah,
anything you want to
absolutely.
I've got a question about the free trappers.
Yeah, hit me.
Were those people looked at a little differently? Like, were they, I want to say, despised or kind of envied by some of the company men?
Envy is probably the better word. Envy, because they were much more free. Some of these companies ran almost military, like military style. It was, you got your marching orders and you went where you're supposed to. Where the romanticized mountain man that we kind of think of in movies and stories, that was much more based on those free trappers who were very, very small minority compared to the company men. Yeah. So one of the things that allowed this whole mountain men process to happen was this right here. This is a beaver trap. Now, this leg hold trap, which is what you call the general type. Now, this one's from my teaching collection, and so it's soldered closed, so little children don't break their fingers off. So I can't like open it up for you. But you would step on the little and anyone listening at home, feel free to Google beaver trap. But you would step on the two sides, open it up, and then there'd be this little pin right here that would hold it in place. Leg hold traps were actually first used over in Europe, and they were used against humans. So rich landowners would hide them all over their land, so poachers would get caught. They were then eventually mass-produced. And the mass-produced beaver trap was one of the reasons that mountain men were able to exist, because, they didn't have the skills the Native American people had for, generations that have been trapping using snares and stuff like that. So, this little pressure plate on the foot snare, what they would do is take castor. There's actually a recipe. It's castor plus a couple other little things you put in there, but it's mainly castor. The mountain men, when they would kill a beaver, they would squeeze and drain those castor glands into a little castor bottle. And then they would smear that castor on the pressure plate. They would have to wade out into these snowy, frozen rivers, wearing nothing but like leathers and moccasins most of the time. Wade out into this water. And pretty much every beaver trap has a chain attached to it. They would set the beaver trap, put the castor oil on it, put it down in the water, and then they would take their hatchet to hammer in a stake through the chain in the water. This meant, that other trappers, whether they're from different companies or Native American tribes, couldn't come and like steal their beaver, because it'd be under the water, you wouldn't be able to see it. But also what this means is when the beaver stepped on it, because the castor smell would attract the beavers. They'd be like, who is this? I don't recognize the smell. They would go over, get stuck on it. It would close around their leg, and they would be stuck under the surface of the water. Now, beavers can hold their breath for about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I mean, we've been recording for 38 minutes. If a beaver was with us, it could have only taken 3 breaths so far. Pretty amazing. But they can't hold their breath forever. So eventually they would drown. What's nice about that is there'd be no damage to their fur. Also, the cold water would keep it from decomposing, and it would keep other scavengers like hawks, eagles, vultures, foxes, bobcats, mountain lions, bears, any of those poachers from finding it, because it'd be under the water. So the beaver trap was really, really important. Now, once they killed the beaver and then went back and collected it, the most important tool they had was this dude, the green river knife. Let's see the handle there. This is an actual historic Green River knife.
Brad, you need one of those.
And so from the Green River Company.
Give me about 2 weeks.
What's that?
Give me about 2 weeks, I'll have one.
I said Brad needs one of those, and he said, give me about 2 weeks.
Yeah. So this curved knife, the Green River knife, was one of the most important things a mountain man could have. And if he lost this, he was up a creek without a paddle. And so this obviously not super sharp, because I let children hold this. So, but this knife, this curved knife, is what they use to skin the beavers. So skin all the fat and stuff off of the beavers, and then they would take sticks in the form of a circle and stretch it around the circle to dry it out, salt it, and preserve it, and to keep it from decomposing. But the Beaver Trap and the Green River Knife are probably two of the most important tools, if not the most important tools, a mountain man trapper would have at his disposal. So they trap all year long, and then they go to the rendezvous. A rendezvous was normally put on by one of the companies. So you chose what company's rendezvous to go to. And the mountain men pretty much did all their shopping in a week. They would sell all of their pelts and then buy whatever they needed. So we're talking bullets, gunpowder, any non-wild food you want to eat. All of that stuff, they had to buy it at the rendezvous. Now, you would have company men for that company, plus you would have free trappers, and maybe some company men from other companies if they had filled their quota with their own company. But you could have a lot of different mountain men come into these rendezvous. But here's the deal. Across the entire mountain man period, they estimate only about 3,000 mountain men ever existed in the Rocky Mountains. So it wasn't like, this massive amount of people out there. Throughout the entire 40 to 50 year period, we're looking at about 3,000 people total. And so it was a pretty small community, but they would go to these rendezvous, sell all their beaver pelts and other pelts too. I'll show you some other pelts after the next round of questions. And they would basically then use their earnings to then buy stuff from the rendezvous. It made these companies really rich for a while, and the mountain men never really got pretty wealthy, most of them, because a lot of times the prices would be so marked up, they would end up needing to buy more than they had enough from their beavers. So companies would be like, hey, I got you, Zach. Why don't we'll give you an extra 15 beavers worth of stuff this year. Just next year, you owe us an extra 15 beavers. And then you come back next year, you're like, okay, we've taken our extra 15. Oh, now you need 30 beavers worth of extra stuff. Okay, you can have that, but now you owe us an extra 30 beavers next year. And some of these, especially free trappers, could get in an insurmountable amount of debt in these rendezvous.
Is there still a rendezvous? Okay, where's a rendezvous site that's close to us, like Northern Colorado, Wyoming? Is there a famous one around here somewhere?
Well, the one that we have nowadays for the reenactors is at Fort Bridger, which was a fort started by Jim Bridger, which is initially a mountain man trading fort, then became an Oregon Trail trading fort. But historically, there was some up in Wyoming. Give me 2 seconds. I'm trying to remember the name of it, where it was historically. I do not remember right now, to tell you the truth. I don't think I have my notes in front of me. So there were a few rendezvous in the area, the front range, but historic, and they would also move in different years, kind of move around. I don't remember where the historic one was right now, and I don't have it easily in front of me. But yeah, the one that we have now, where they kind of reenact the Mountain Man Rendezvous, was at Fort Bridger here in Wyoming. It was just a couple weekends ago, actually. It's Labor Day weekend each year.
I know. I missed it. I wanted to go up there to it. I just missed it.
I need to fly out for one of those.
Questions about Mountain Men.
But yeah, so anything else you want to ask before I show you some of the other animals that they would have trapped as well? And then we'll talk more about what they eat and the dangers of their life and stuff like that.
I was wanting to see what drew these individuals to that lifestyle.
Yeah, I imagine it's as varied as if you ask someone why they're a football player today, or why they're a teacher, or whatever, your guys' day jobs, whatever brought all of your colleagues to that. I mean, it's probably just as varied as we would find today. Like for the museum, why do my colleagues work at a museum? Probably different for each of us, but there's some similarities, like getting away from the the East, getting out into the wild. There was also all these once the Mountain Men period started, there was all these romanticized stories about them, which made more people want to come out, which led to some deaths and some people saying, oh, this is not what the stories tell us, and going back east. But it's like get away from the civilization to get out. Well, okay, that's really xenocentric, because there were civilizations out in the Rocky Mountains. Let me be very clear about that. There were people who, for 10, 13,000 years, who are living in this place, with all different cultures. But the European culture, get away from that in the East and get out to something new. experience the wilderness. But a lot of it was just from those stories going back east that were getting more and more people coming out. It's kind of like, think about what drove people to Hollywood. It was the stories of what Hollywood could be. Go be famous. Then people get out there and they're like, I am poor and I'm waiting tables. I am not Lady Gaga. And so maybe she's not great. I don't think she's Hollywood, but still, it was kind of that same thing, romanticized stories that brought more people out.
Earlier you mentioned that there were groups of 15 or 50 up to 100 people, not just men. Would people bring their families with them?
Yeah, so here's one of the cool points. It was young men who went out. They did not bring their families with them. But they did start families. So many, many, many mountain men married native wives and even married into the tribes. Now, there's this view of mountain men running from Native American tribes. And don't get me wrong, there was conflict between native people and mountain men. I mean, the mountain men were literally trespassing on native land. They were breaking the law, poaching native populations of animals. They were the aggressor. But as a general rule, tribes were much more likely to trade with the mountain men because the mountain men brought I'm going to show you some trade goods here in a minute, but I'll show you now. The mountain men brought trade goods with them. Now, they couldn't bring big, heavy things. Native people did go to the rendezvous too, by the way. Native people would go to the rendezvous and trade, but the mountain men would bring trade goods as well. So this, for example, is a trade bell. Here, I'll ring it. Hawk bells, copper bells, lots of bells. Were a lead shot was another commonly traded item. Metal arrowheads. This was another great trade item because, the native people were not making metal goods. Their arrowheads were made from bones, normally bison bones, or from stone. Trade mirrors. Whoa, I'm going to break my little trade mirror. Trade mirrors in different shapes and sizes, but trade mirrors were another great one. Little pieces of silver. This is a very old, I am all thumbs, little turtle, little silver turtle made from actual silver. So the mountain men would normally carry these little things in what they called a possibles bag, which would allow them to have little trade items on them in case they came across Native American people. Number one, maybe peace offerings, but number two, possibly trade goods. And many mountain men married into native tribes, and some of them, especially free trappers, would actually spend winter sometimes with their Native American tribes they married into, because they're not trapping in the dead of winter, and they would actually stay in those. Not always. I mean, thousands of varied stories, but many mountain men had Native American wives. There's diary entries talking about mountain man brigades that were 100 persons strong. 50% of them are families. And now, while initially, a lot of European descent people were the mountain men, about 50% Anglo-Saxon, about a quarter French American, French Canadian, and then you got some Black African American folks, some Spanish and Mexican trappers, and some Native American trappers as well. But there were a lot more Native American trappers later on because some of those European American people started having children with their Native American wives and raising them out in the mountain man territory. Now, remember, a lot of mountain men also weren't out there long enough to raise families, 2, 3, 6 years and back out east. There were some that were out there for a very long time and raising families, not just having wives.
Did the American government get involved in the fur trade industry?
No, that's a very good question, and not.
And it's kind of a tricky question.
I don't have
militaries out there to maybe support these groups.
Well, and so I would tell you, there were forts, but a lot of the forts actually started up after the Mountain Man period. So, for example, because right after the Mountain Man period, the Oregon Trail period starts. And that's when the immigrants, like hundreds of thousands of immigrants, start moving through the territories. And that opened up a lot of more army presence along the trails. But during the Mountain Man time period, there wasn't a huge military presence out there. I'm sure a true historian can give you more insight on that. But yeah, a lot of the forts, because the U.S. government actually bought some Mountain Man trading forts to turn into forts to protect the immigrants after the Mountain Man collapsed. Now, I do want to say that, other animals were trapped as well, trapped or shot. For example, this is a Canada lynx. And if you thought a beaver was soft, you should feel a Canada lynx. These are listed as threatened in the lower 48 states, but they're not there. So they're protected by the U.S. government in the lower 48. But up in Alaska, they're protected. They're managed by the state, not the government, not the federal government. But Canada lynx. They would also trap raccoon. There's raccoon right here, and a lot of foxes. So this is a gray fox. If you think about Ohio area, you guys are going to have gray foxes. This is an arboreal fox that lives more in the forest. This is the only canine in North America that can climb trees like a cat. This is a prairie fox. This is called a swift fox. It's the littlest fox in North America, along with, or at least in the U.S., along with the kit fox. And then, of course, you've got the red fox. A beautiful red fox, the biggest fox in the world, the biggest true fox in the world, with big old fluffy tails. But these were not trapped as much as beavers. Now,
muskrat.
Ooh, literally my next thing. Now, if you want to learn what the, quote, poor man's beaver was, and that is muskrat. So this is a muskrat right here. Muskrat have a lot of the same habitats as beavers. Their tail isn't flat like a beaver's. It's kind of like round and kind of more like up and down pointy, but muskrat are incredibly soft, just like beavers. They have 2 layers of fur, just like beavers. And muskrat hats, because a beaver hat, if up in over in England, where a lot of these pelts were being sent to, I mean, they would be trapped here, but sent over to England, or I say Europe, sent over to Europe. Over in Europe, it would take an unskilled laborer 6 weeks of pay to buy 1 beaver hat. The rich, fancy people were wearing them so that everyone in society wanted to wear them. And so an unskilled laborer probably wasn't buying beaver skin or beaver felt hats. A skilled laborer, blacksmith, tailor, it would still take them 6 days of work. I mean, imagine working for 6 days, not spending money on food, rent, electricity, just to buy 1 hat. So muskrat hats were a bit cheaper, and you really couldn't tell the difference too much. And the other big trapped item was this dude right here. You guys know what this is?
Weasel?
Oh, the biggest weasel in the Rocky Mountains. It's not really a weasel. It's the otter. The river otter.
Otter.
Oh. Yeah. Otters are also super, super soft. And a weasel family. But you know what? Fishers may be bigger than river otters, actually. So fishers may actually be the biggest weasel.
I want to go back to your comment about imagine working 6 days just to buy a hat. Brad, I'm pretty confident. I know you would work 6 days just to buy a muskrat hat.
Zach knows me all too well. I would at least work 12 days to have a good fur hat.
Wow. So these mountain men,
right now he's calculating the hours in his head. Like, what do I got to work for that?
8 times 6. Yeah. Well, you can get it cheaper now. So let me show you cool things. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time show and telling because I know most people are going to be listening to this. But this is a Mountain Man Gourd water bottle. A lot of times the greenies would come out with wooden canteens, but they wouldn't last too long. So most Mountain Men ended up making their own canteens out of large gourds. And so this is a great example of a gourd water bottle. They also, Mountain Men were really interesting because they have a lot of, stuff from out east, like their Green River knife and their traps, but also Native American items. So this is a Native American made knife. Now the metal would have come out east, but as a leather handle, a leather scabbard, this is a same time period, a Native American made knife. Another important piece for fire building would be a flint and steel, like a striker and flint, or a tinder box. So tinder box are little copper boxes. You'd keep your tinder inside, the stuff that can start a fire really well. And the top of it would have a magnifying glass on it, which means you could use the top of your tinder box to use the sun and start a fire with a magnifying glass without having to worry about, using your flint and steel. So
That's pretty ingenious.
yeah. And then this is a steel striker right here. You kind of hold it like this and you spark it up. So the mountain man was a tough life though. I mean, their diet was almost consistently meat with more meat and a side of meat. They would eat a lot of bison, cook it, boil it. They weren't great cooks, and sometimes if they hadn't eaten a few days, there's stories of men finding a bison, shooting it, and just eating the meat raw because they were so hungry. Mountain men would starve to death from lack of food. They would also make pemmican, which is a Native American food, and they would trade with Native American people for pemmican for food as well, jerky and pemmican. Think of pemmican like a meat granola bar. And so it's got bits of meat, grease, and dried fruit, and they would cook it slow cook it, dry it out, and it could last for a very long time. Another food they would eat is a tail of beavers. So they would cut the tail off, they would slice it long strips like bacon shape kind of, and then they would fry that up and they would eat beaver tail. Now, everyone who's ever eaten beaver tail nowadays says that it is terrible and chewy and like disgusting, but Mountain Man journals talk about how it's great. So either they're really, really trolling us in the future, or they had a very different sense of taste than we do today. But
Zach, I was close.
Yeah. They would also sometimes eat stuff like prairie dogs. Yeah. We need sometimes prairie dogs. I think I have a prairie dog right here. But yeah, 2 seconds.
They would tan prairie dogs.
No, they would eat them occasionally, but it wasn't one of their normal foods. This is kind of just one of their, one of the things that we eat. It was mainly meat. Now they would also get, whatever fruits they could gather, but they weren't going and like buying. They didn't have canned goods or anything like that. They were really eating mainly what they could get from the land or what they could trade for, and their diet was incredibly meat heavy. I mean, probably the closest we've had to carnivores in our country, very, very meat heavy. So if you like eating nothing but meat, maybe you could survive as a mountain man. But there are a lot of other dangers, like dying from dehydration. There was wild animal attacks. Grizzly bear attacks were relatively common. I mean, and so grizzly bear, moose, falling off of rocks. There was also Jacques Laramie, which like Laramie is named after the city of Laramie, the county of Laramie. Jacques Laramie, he was thought to have got washed away in a river and drowned. Right here in Wyoming, freezing to death, starving to death. Remember, they're waiting in incredibly cold, snowy temperatures, waiting in waist deep water to set these traps, and then basically just drying off. Their way they slept.
So, Jeremy?
Yeah, hit me.
No, go ahead and finish that, because I was going to ask kind of what brought about the end of the Mountain Man. But
yeah, so
it's
a good topic because we're getting close to an hour here. And so, so they would sleep like sometimes they would have tents. Most of the time they were sleeping out under the stars. Or like in a lean-to, they take a canvas and put it between two poles, which have a lean-to there under. There's all these journal entries talking about laying down a bison fur, laying on top of it, and then just covering up with blankets in the mud. And as you sleep, you sink into the mud, and cold water from the rain washes in. And the only way to stay warm is to not move, so the pond that you are sleeping in stays warm water. Because if you turn or roll over, cold, fresh water rushes in and freezes you. I mean, it was tough life. Yeah, you were outside. It wasn't camping like we know it today, where you zip up your tent and you're okay. It's literally bugs, snakes, scorpions, rain, grizzly bears, conflict with other mountain men and Native American people, thirst, dehydration, But to your point, what kind of brought about the end of this, it's really funny. It goes back to hats. So the mountain men reigned from, early 1800s, 1810-ish, to about 1840 or 1850. Started dying pretty close to, 1850. Not only were the populations dropping, just like they did in Europe and Asia, just like they did in the East, the populations were dropping. But on top of that, there was a man out in England, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. And one day, he wore a silk hat instead of a beaver hat. And from that point on, he wore silk hats. And so all the wealthy, well-to-do people decided they had to have silk hats. And that fashion trickled down from initially the rich, fancy people in Europe wanted beaver hats, and then everyone needed beaver hats, and the beaver craze started. Prince Albert pretty much single-handedly started wearing silk hats, and that trickled through all of Europe and into the New World. And almost like by like historic view, overnight, the market for the beaver trade, it just fell out. The bottom fell out of it, and no one wanted them. No one's buying them. The forts went out of business. Many of these fur companies, save from basically the Hudson Bay Company, pretty much all these fur companies went out of business. The native people who relied on the beaver trade for stuff like pots and pans and clothes, all of a sudden they were thrust into poverty because their number one way to get trade items was no longer possible. Everything ended. Now these mountain men had to instantly find new ways of life. What they ended up doing was some of them joined the army as scouts, because shortly after this, the frontier wars would start with the native people in the late 1800s. Some of them became guides for Oregon Trail. They'd gone back and forth across the Rockies. They knew the routes. They had opened up these routes that they learned from the native people. And so they became guides for the Oregon Trail. Other of them opened forts. Jim Bridger took this mountain man fort that he had and turned it into a trading fort for the Oregon Trail. Hudson Bay Company turned Fort Boise, Fort Idaho, those mountain man trading forts, they turned into trading forts for the Oregon Trail. And others just settled down with their families and their wives and started a life, in the quiet life in the areas they'd always known. But the mountain man time period is this amazingly, fascinating time. But historically speaking, it's a blip, I should say, not a blimp, a blip in the timeline. And, this whole fur trade, it really was at 300 years from the 1550s when the beaver hat craze started to the 1850s. During the height of the beaver craze, the Hudson Bay Company, they were sending 80,000 pelts a year back to Europe. And that was enough to fill 3 giant sailing ships. And you may say, well, 80,000 doesn't seem like a lot when there are 150 million beavers. But remember, this went on for 200 years here in the New World. Beavers were facing extinction as well here in North America due to the beaver trade. Now, luckily, things have turned around since the fur trade, has kind of fallen out. Over in Europe, you got about between 650,000 to 1 million Eurasian beavers. They've been reintroduced to a lot of their old range, like Britain, Scotland, Spain, France, and other places. In North America, estimates have us about 10 million to 15 million beavers. Not 150 million, but still about 10% where we used to be, but much better than the brink of extinction that we found ourselves facing down at one point. Yeah, it's a fascinating time period. And if you look across Wyoming, you still see, remnants of mountain men, Fort Bridger, Fort Laramie, the city of Laramie, Teton Bridger National Forest, the Bridger Mountains. There's a lot of places still named after these charismatic mountain men that lived in the Rocky Mountains.
Absolutely fascinating.
What a period.
Brad, do you have any other questions before I launch into?
No, man, I tell you, the amount of knowledge Jeremy has on this period, it's just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Well, if you would like to Oregon Trail or Bison Culture Program, I've got those in the loaded up, ready to go whenever you would like to talk about that.
Well, that'd be fantastic.
Well, we'll do that. Trust me, we're going to do that.
Well, gentlemen, I really had fun. Anything else you want to ask me?
The mountain man culture is so odd because it's been so romanticized, and like you said, the minority of mountain men has been brought into this mainstream culture of, okay, we think of mountain men as these hard-bitten, old timers up in the mountains, and you're right, that's not the case.
It was teenagers and college age kids running around trapping things, like trying not to starve to death or get swept away in a river, or get eaten by a grizzly bear.
If people wanted to find out more, like does the Wyoming State Museum have an online resource where they can go and kind of check out what we just talked about?
So we do have, so if you go to our website, we do have some online exhibits. We just revamped our website during COVID, and so we're still getting a lot of our exhibits online, like our online collections and stuff. There's not a lot about mountain men online right now, but I would encourage you to come by our museum. Like I said, we're open besides state holidays, about 10 of them a year. We're open Monday through Saturday, 9 to 4:30. We are always free. And if you happen to be a teacher out there, we do, or Boys and Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boys and Girls Club, some other organization with kids, we do free virtual field trips no matter where you are in the world. And we can teach some of this stuff, whether you want to learn about animals or Native American culture, mountain men, Oregon Trail. We have a lot of different programs. You can find our programs on our website too.
That's great. Brad, you got anything to add before we wrap it up?
No, I just want to thank Jeremy for his time and knowledge. I'm sure a lot of people is going to learn how it really went down with the mountain men era. And I like specifically how it started with hats and it ended with hats. I think that's pretty neat.
The fur trade is really the timeline of hat to hat. That is a great way to look at the timeline of the beat. It's 300 years of hats.
Jeremy, it's been a pleasure. We've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Yeah. Hope to see you guys again soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy.